Philip, who I talked about, who'd been introducing that as a standalone bill over and over and over again in the Senate, amended the bill on the floor successfully to include that, which is kind of amazing because it had been like 6 years of trying to make that happen. So the background check law, there are federal background checks. If you go to a licensed firearm dealer, they go through a whole process of checking you against some federal databases, and there are a number of things that would preclude you from possessing a gun, like a history of violence, history of like severe mental health issues, things like that. But if you, in most states, if you go to someone who's not federally licensed, like a private gun, you do a private gun sale, like Amanda sells a gun, or Ms. Gustafson sells a gun to me, or I go to a gun show and there's federal dealers, in the gun show, but in the parking lot, people are just selling guns, which is something that happens. Those do not go through a background check process, so that's a way that a lot of people have skirted that process. And so we made our background check law in Vermont applies the federal background check process to private gun sales. So it says if you're having that kind of private gun sale, you have to actually go to a federally licensed firearm dealer and have them conduct a background check for you. So now we have background checks for any kind of gun sale in Vermont. And then we added on the House side some things to that bill too. So we added a provision that said that we basically banned the sale of high capacity magazines, which are attachments that you can add to firearms to make them shoot more rounds of ammunition, so you don't have to stop and reload as often. And that was probably the most controversial thing that we did, because those kinds of devices are very common in like a lot of sporting and hunting traditions and just gun owner traditions, and those are very strong traditions in the state of Vermont. So we banned those devices, but with a lot of exemptions and caveats that kind of came to us through the process in the form of amendments. And then we also banned what are called bump stocks, which is another device you can outfit a firearm with that basically prevents it from sort of like jerking back a little bit when you fire it, and so it just makes it easier to fire more quickly. So both of those things are devices that people have used to basically turn more conventional handguns into like really like automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons that can fire lots of rounds really quickly. So those were things we added on the House side, and I supported all of those things and was really grateful to have an opportunity to work on them.
Can we talk about what happened in Texas on Friday? And do you know that 10 kids were killed?
Yeah, I think it was 8 kids and 2 teachers maybe,
Yeah.
But yes, yeah, that was really heartbreaking and upsetting. And I think the thing that was the most heartbreaking to me was reading an excerpt of an interview of one of the survivors of that shooting, and the reporter, or the camera person maybe, was asking, did you think to yourself, this couldn't happen here, there's no way this could be happening in my school? And the person said no. And the camera person said, why not? And they said, because it's happening everywhere. I assumed it would happen at my school eventually, which I just found to be like so chilling, that's that we've normalized this kind of occurrence so much that would be someone's reaction, a kid, a high school student. And I think the other thing that many things I've thought about. I mean, one thing, Texas does not have a lot of gun violence prevention regulations, and those regulations, I think, have been proven to help reduce gun fatalities, but it's not there's not an assurance that if you have those regulations that mass shootings and school shootings won't happen. So I think we need those kinds of laws, and we also need work to address some of the root causes of how someone gets to that place. Like, there's a study that was done of school shootings from Columbine to kind of the mid-2000s that a witness brought to our committee, and there's one thing that all school shooters have in common. There's one common thing. Can you guess what it is? They're all men. So there's something about I think there's something about masculinity and how we allow and encourage the expression of that needs to be addressed when we think about how to prevent this. In the case of the Texas shooter, one of the people he shot was a classmate who had rebuffed his advances, a young woman who he had wanted to date or something, and she was one of his targeted victims. I think that just says a lot about our culture and how we're raising boys, frankly. And then similarly, I don't know about the Texas school shooting, but we've seen a lot of kind of racist tendencies and bias in some of the school shootings and in some of the training that some of the school shooters have been actively interested and engaged in white supremacist groups. And then it also seems clear that a lot of people who are perpetrating these acts have their own history of trauma and abuse. So all of that is stuff I thought about in relationship to that incident too. Like, what are the tools and resources that we need to be helping people not get to the point where that seems like a viable thing to do, to deal with.
Yeah. And is there more we should do for gun control?
I think there are some more things that we should do, yes. I think looking at storage is really key, and trying to make sure we do that in ways that work with the Second Amendment, which does say that people have the right to bear arms and use them for self-defense. But, there's a lot of situations where guns are just stored openly in homes, and kids have ready and easy access to them. And I think there's probably a better balance we can strike. In Burlington, a bunch of years ago, I was a city councilor in Burlington before I was a legislator, and we passed a number of local gun violence prevention laws. So one was about mirrored the domestic violence bill that we finally passed statewide, but one of them was about safe storage, kind of mandating safe storage of firearms, and we needed approval from the legislature to make those be part of our local ordinance, and they would not give it. That was at a time when the legislature would not act on gun control measures at all, to the point where they would not allow a change in our local ordinances that the majority of Burlington voters had supported. So I think looking at safe storage is something we could be doing at the state level. I think another thing is looking at the question of automatic weapons and what constitutes an automatic weapon, and what kind of access we want to allow around that. And then, I think it would be a very, very hard culture shift to pass in Vermont, but looking at both countries that have really successful gun regulations and even some states where they've passed gun control measures that have seriously reduced fatalities. Having a registry of guns is something that I'm a librarian when I'm not a legislator, so I rely on evidence a lot, and there's just a lot of evidence that is one of the components of a gun regulation system that really helps to reduce gun deaths. I think it would be an incredibly hard thing to pass in the state of Vermont just because of the culture of support for easy access to guns. So that would be probably a longer term conversation, but just looking at what has worked in other places, it is clear that has been a key component. And then I think also looking at some of those root cause issues around how people get to the point where they are ready and willing to perpetrate gun violence, but also how we support people in removing themselves from dangerous situations, especially women who are statistically, and especially women in abusive situations, which is a place where there's a huge risk of gun violence. I think, where I'm looking at, and with some other legislators, some measures of how I think we can do better there.
So yeah, thank you. That was it.
Thanks. Yeah, really good questions. Thanks for letting me read them in advance. It's helpful.